So it's an interesting question, really, as to why silence both is an attraction for us and also we're somewhat aversive to it as well. It seems to hold something that is very essential, and at the same time, it seems to take something away that we're very used to. And this sort of attraction and aversion weighs throughout much of our practice. The sense of that stillness, in its essence, holds or defines what is sacred. Really, in some ways, that our hearts just release it releases into, and yet stillness, by definition, takes us away from the noise and the continual commentary which has defined us. So in some ways, we're left in a dilemma in which we are pulled or realize that in order for us to acquire or access the sacred, there needs to be a new relationship to stillness. And at the same time, there may be some fear or anxiety about pulling ourselves too close to stillness because we won't be as defined and know ourselves in the same way as we get quieter. And I think this dilemma of sort of this approach avoidance of stillness defines much of our spiritual journey. And so that for a lot of our spiritual journey, we don't really, we're not that interested in being still. We're interested in working out on our problems within our storyline. And so even though we sit down, we don't move. We're not really there to be still, but to sort of continue an inward, more subtle monologue regarding whatever it is that's arising and how to adequately work with whatever is arising. And so it gets more subtle, it gets directed in line with what we think is the teaching. It has a Dharma focus, and that I'm trying to relax and not resist. But those words, relax and non-resistance, are really words that point towards stillness. The resolution of pain arises in stillness. It doesn't arise through the fixing mentality. It doesn't arise through our endeavor, through our strategies to fix it. We end pain by being still. And yet somehow that's the last straw. We don't really want to go there. It's our least. It's the choice it's our least desirable choice. But this whole Buddhism in general, meditation specifically in Buddhism, is an inextricable movement towards stillness. I mean, when we see our inward life arising and we add nothing to it, we are simply being still with it. We're not creating a secondary dialogue about it. We're simply holding our mind in awareness, which is absolutely still. Whatever arises, just this. Just this. And as soon we have to start understanding where this is taking us so that we can join the journey rather than to fight this journey of stillness. We are so used to living with the noise of problem solving, of seeing what's arising and applying a particular analytical resolution to what's arising, We haven't given ourselves over to stillness. We haven't allowed stillness to really show us what it can do. And so with this approach avoidance, we somehow realize that being quiet is necessary. I mean, the retreat was on silence. And yet, it's not clear to us that the journey of spiritual awakening has anything to do with stillness itself. Now, you can put in any measure, any way that you define the resolution of your spiritual journey, and it will be equal to the word stillness. For instance, the end of suffering. The Buddha framed it as suffering to the end of suffering. That's a spiritual journey. The end of suffering is the end of the story about the suffering. It's not necessarily about the resolution or the end of an unpleasant experience. It's the end of the story which says essentially to this unpleasant experience that you're unwelcomed. It's the unwelcoming that is the end of suffering. Or we could define the spiritual journey from self to selflessness. And you will also see that the louder and the more demonstrative, the more reactive you are in yourself, the more you're present, the more you're defined, the more you are held in relief to what you're saying, from what you're saying or what you're reacting to. And the more you're in relief to something you're reacting to, the more definition, personal definition you have as an embodied person. And the quieter you are, the more vague, the less defined you are. And vagueness in our culture feels like has a negative connotation. Like, no one wants to be vague. You need an opinion to, where are you formed? I want to feel you. That's sort of the way we approach the culture. The culture approaches. See, the culture in general tries to distance itself from stillness. And yet the quieter we are, something precious is discovered. We feel something in us arising that we've missed in all of our noise. We could say that the spiritual journey was from knowing to not knowing. It's very clear that the more you know, the louder and more noisy you are. The more you define each and everything you see, the more the definer and the seer is in place as well. And the more you allow the world to come into quietude, to come into wonder, the greater the sense of mystery, internally and externally. And the richer the sense of abundance, of vitality, of aliveness. So stillness isn't void. It's really very full. In the same way that cosmologists are now explaining that space, vacuum, is very full. It's very rich. It's not nothing. In the same way, stillness is not nothing. Although it's nothing in form, it doesn't mean it is nothing. It's very rich in aliveness. And as we have more faith, or we give more of our primary concern to seeing the advantages, seeing the value of being quiet, we will come more and more into that sense of fullness, of abundance. We step out of ourselves. We step out of our definition. Stepping out of ourselves means nothing more than stepping out of an image we have of ourselves. You don't suddenly collapse. You just step out of an idea. that has defined us. That's all. And what we step into is so much greater than the contracted and enclosed, embalmed sense of the idea that we wonder why we ever compressed ourselves into such a small area. So I would move us today in the direction of greater stillness. Just whatever is arising. We are not going to be able to stop the forms arising in mind. The forms of thought, the forms of physical sensation, the forms of emotion. Those are going to arise. But we can put less of our attention on that which is arising and allow more of our energy to be in that which holds what's arising. What is it arising into? And the answer to that is stillness. It's always the same. It can only arise into one thing. We have to allow ourselves to be less distinct, to be a little more vague, to be a little less clearly outlined. It's more like, as a child, we all connected the dots and it formed a figure. Now we're erasing the line and just letting the dots be there. We're going backward. Are we courageous enough? Are we courageous enough?